Hi there, everybody. I'm Florence Halstead, and I am a researcher here at the University of Hull. I work in the Faculty of Arts, Culture and Education and the Energy and Environment Institute, and I'm going to present to you today some of my experiences of working in Vietnam within their education system, and I'm going to explore some of the challenges and opportunities that they face in a changing world. To give you a little bit of context, my PhD was based in Vietnam and I was exploring children's experiences, understandings, and perceptions of climate change there. So, to do that, I was working within schools, and what I found was, in short, a big barrier to their perceptions and accurate understandings of climate change was the existing education system and the kind of cultural context that is embedded within. Now, I'm not here to present to you today exactly about that. I'm kind of tweaking this to make it more focused on education in general. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Hope you find it interesting, and you can see my email and Twitter at the bottom of this page. So if you do have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out and I'll try and answer them as best I can. Okay. I'll start first by giving a little bit of context to Vietnam. So, Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia and it is considered a lower middle income country. It has various topography, as you can see from the map on the left. There's an awfully long coastline, but it also has really high mountains up near Hanoi, the capital city up there, and then there's some major deltas which are high productivity regions for rice production and many other agricultural activities, which are still remaining as one of the major exports for the region. That's what brings in most of the wealth and economy to the area. As a region, they have a long history of war. Some of you might know about the Vietnamese War with America, French occupation, but even predating that, China owned and colonised Vietnam for quite a long time. This is going back centuries. They've long been a piece of land that people have been fighting over and fighting for, which makes them characteristically very resilient people. They also face an awful lot of natural disasters. Now I've put that in quotation marks because there's no real such thing as a natural disaster. It's all to do with the systems that surround people that make them vulnerable to disasters, i.e., if we build in a vulnerable location, then what is a natural event then becomes a disaster. If people are living in poverty and don't have the right infrastructure, then that event, that natural hazard, then becomes a natural disaster. And these events have caused poverty to the region for centuries. They've really struggled through various, like I say, various wars and various natural disasters. They did experience the Doi Moi policy in 1986, which opened them up to world trade and a market economy. Prior to this, the rice based agricultural sector was purely within house, I suppose you could call it. Things weren't exported, they didn't really communicate or work with anybody else outside of Vietnam, and this really kind of made it hard for the country to make money. And again, this really put a lot of pressure on individuals, farmers, locals. They do still, however, remain a one-party state, and they are one of only 5 remaining communist states. Now, this is quite important for context as well, because this really means that government control is very high, personal autonomy is low, speaking out against the government is not typically done. Here, you see very many like political kind of rallies. You get to choose who you vote for. That system doesn't really exist in Vietnam. They have a leader, they have and they have a governmental party, but we don't, like the people on the ground don't have much say in how or who that is. What else am I missing from this? I think that kind of gives a very brief overview. I think what you need to take away from this slide is that Vietnamese history and the context of Vietnam is extremely nuanced, and there's a lot more than I can cover in the couple of minutes that I've got here. In terms of their cultural context then, I kind of alluded to the various regimes and the various kind of occupancies, the French, the American and the Chinese. And because the Chinese ruled there for so long, it was the Han Dynasty that invaded them. Because of that, they're very, very influenced by Confucianism, which is basically, some call it a religion, but it's basically a system of thought. It depends who you speak to as to which one it's categorised as. And this very much works around several core concepts that are kind of seen to give you moral high ground, so to make you a morally good person and to see you as a beneficial addition to society, I suppose is the best way to put it. This focuses very much on a hierarchical system, so elderly people are very much valued, and people with high education are very much valued. There's some concepts such as face and filial piety. I may have pronounced those incorrectly. Face is basically, we have face in England, so to lose face is to kind of like that embarrassment, that the shame, but it is that times 100 in the Vietnamese context, because to bring any shame on yourself or your family members is just the worst thing that we could possibly do, because they are a culture where things happen almost on a sponsorship basis. So if I was to do something that was considered shameful in Vietnam, my family by default would also be considered shameful. That's like, well, that in traditional thought anyway. And to lose face is one of the worst things that you can do. So this kind of keeps, this pressure to maintain face keeps people with the social order, and it means that they don't dissent against the hierarchical systems that exist there. Filial piety, that's basically about respecting other people. Again, face very much links into this. It's all about kind of achieving that moral goodness, I suppose. And this really does kind of embed itself into cultural norms and cultural systems. Buddhism and Taoism, they also very much underpin the worldviews of Vietnamese, and many of them do run alongside Confucianism and traditional Vietnamese folklore as well. Now, obviously these were introduced to Vietnam many, many centuries ago, so they're very, very robust and they're very hard to kind of eradicate. And a lot of the cultural context actually can be very, very beneficial for education. It can be very beneficial for a changing world, and we'll explore some of this a bit later on. Western influence is, however, growing, particularly in cities. Since that Doi Moi policy era that I spoke of earlier, as they've opened up to the global economy, globalisation has taken a hold of various areas in Vietnam. They have much more access to technology. Some of that is limited by the government. So you can't access some BBC web pages whilst you're out there, for example. But by and large, people in cities do have access to a lot more information, and their views are changing in light of that. So people are delaying getting married, whereas once before, if you were still single by the time you got to 30, you were a bit of a lost cause. You weren't really conforming to the social norms. So change is happening, but those traditional values still have a real stronghold over Vietnam. Looking at the educational structure then, this is obviously underpinned by a lot of what I've just discussed. Education in Vietnam is governed by the Ministry of Education and Training, shortened to MOET, And essentially they have complete control over everything. So they provide the curriculum, and as I'll come to later, they provide like all the teaching materials that teachers can use within schools. Now, the school system is divided into 5 levels. So that's preschool, primary school, secondary school, high school, and higher education. And formal education does consist of 12 years. However, only 5 years of primary education from 6 to 11 are compulsory, which means that once you move beyond that, there are small fees often associated with that level of education. There's also fees associated with primary school education. However, these differ. So technically it is subsidised by the government and free. However, schools are able to charge for example, school supplies. They can ask for money to maintain the building, things like that. So technically it's free, but technically it's kind of not. And it'll depend on the school that you're at. Obviously, this has huge issues for access to education and equality. As I alluded to earlier, teachers have to teach from a single set of centralised textbooks, which are authorised by the government. However, there are some changes in regards to this, so I'll come to that later, and we'll explore how that's actually changing in the modern day. So that's the education structure. But how does that work in context? Now, as I alluded to, the cultural context very much underpins the education system here. So education is highly valued because education is seen as a way to achieve morality. That's a way to kind of become the best version of yourself. It's a way to move through the hierarchy. It's a way to kind of move through the social systems and kind of work your way up. That social mobility is really key to a lot of Vietnamese, especially after living through the war, especially after living through numerous natural disasters where their homes, their livelihoods have been on the brink of disappearing. Many have lost their homes, many have suffered hunger. So for that memory, which is still very raw for many older citizens, they put a lot of investment and pressure on their children to achieve in their education. And this again is underpinned by the cultural traditions ensued by like their traditional values that really kind of hone in on this as a skill that is needed to achieve virtuity. Because of the hierarchy as well, teachers are very highly valued, and that means that they are rarely challenged by even parents. So what the teacher says goes, which obviously means that behaviour is typically very good in classrooms. However, it does mean that free speech and voice for children is somewhat limited. So even if they disagree or they know that something that the teacher is saying is wrong, it's very, very hard for a child to challenge that. This means that children and youth typically lack voice, because with age and education comes virtue, and children and youth typically are young and their education is less so than other people's in the community. Having said that, an interesting shift in the fact that when the war was going on and pre-Doi Moi and many educational reforms, these Vietnamese people accessed less education. Illiteracy was much higher, and so on and so forth. So children are now typically more educated than their parents were. So there is that tension there in that their children are sometimes more educated but still don't have the age to back them up, I suppose. There is, because of this kind of focus on the importance of education, children do experience quite a lot of pressure, especially if their parents have income to be able to spend on their child's education. So many will attend extra classes outside of typical schooling. Obviously, for those that can afford secondary and higher education, their parents will typically find a way to do that. And this is widening the social inequality gap. So even though the lives of most Vietnamese have improved over the past, let's say, 30 years, the gap between those that are doing well and the gap between those that are economically disadvantaged is growing. There's also a focus on academic subjects because of these values. So, maths, Vietnamese language, and science are typically the most important subjects, where the musics and environmental education, for example, these things, although they're included in the curriculum and are highly valued by central government, or it appears so in like curriculum and policy, they don't necessarily translate, much as is the case here, I suppose. So you'll hear a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, a lot of kids moaning in England because there's such a big focus on maths, English literacy, and there's not much room to explore the other kind of skills that are required for children. Um, there's also a typical history of rote learning, so learning by memory, very much kind of textbook based learning. And this is both historically contextualized and culturally contextualized, as well as present day barriers. So the fact that class sizes are quite big, teachers are typically not permitted to go on, like they don't have the capacity to go on training courses, parental kind of pressures mean that because they've got to go through all these academic subjects and they've got to pass tests, they'll put a lot of pressure on rote learning and teaching to the test as well. So the government is doing a lot of pushes to kind of increase creativity within education, and in fact an awful lot of policies have kind of mandated this and really fought for this. However, the lack of teacher autonomy and the fact that this is within this cultural system, with these other barriers remaining, means that it's incredibly difficult. Like, it's very hard to implement a creative curriculum when you have 40 children in your class, for example. As I alluded to earlier, FACE and Philal Petit, they also kind of prevent the sharing of different opinions, and they also kind of focus on collective thought over individualism. So here in the UK, we're quite an individualist state, in that we kind of think of ourselves and our closest family members first before we think about anybody else. They very much, because they have to have this virtue, they think of others before they think of themselves in decision making, which actually offers a lot of opportunities for many of the future and current problems that Vietnamese face. And interestingly, the Vietnamese in PISA tests outperform the UK. So they do rank higher. However, what we need to take into account here is that there are high dropout rates at secondary school, which is when the PISA tests take place. So these are somewhat warped by the fact that those students who are taking part in the tests are typically the ones from more economically advantaged families who typically perform better in these tests. It's not a fair kind of assessment, really, because those who have dropped out to go and work on their local farm, for example, are not included within the statistics. So that's the education system kind of in context and a wraparound of it. However, there is a lot of change happening, as I've kept mentioning as I've gone through this. Basically, as we speak, there is a curriculum reform taking place where more autonomy is going to be given to teachers. Now, I'm going to kind of touch upon some of my research findings specifically here, because one of the major challenges that Vietnamese face at the moment and going into the future will be climate change, and is climate change. So basically, they've got rising seas. Obviously, I've just shown you the map with the coastal areas. This is going to be a big issue for them, particularly for those farmers that rely on rice paddy fields, which can't tolerate salt water. So when that salt water gets into their rice fields, those rice crops die. For example, in the mountainous areas, climate change is increasing landslides and flooding and drought. There's a myriad of problems that are taking place here. And unfortunately, there's also a lot of actions that the Vietnamese are doing or that other outside investors are doing that are actually exasperating these problems, such as building dams and sand mining and groundwater extraction. I won't get too much into that, but what this will allow by making the curriculum more localized and giving teachers more autonomy, it will allow for those local concepts to be taught to students. Now, the exact opposite of this was the barrier that I identified within my PhD. So, because they were teaching from centrally controlled textbooks that they couldn't really deviate from, they were learning about global climate change as opposed to how their locality will be impacted, and therefore their resilience and their ability to adapt to it was rather minimal. However, if teachers are given this autonomy to teach locally and to allow children and their students and the wider community at large, in fact, to understand climate change as a how will it impact us way, then this will really, really kind of support their resilience going forward. Obviously, within this, there are still the existing barriers, so there's still large class sizes that will make that incredibly difficult. There's also going to be issues with ensuring that teachers understand climate change, for example, to be able to teach it, and that there's this kind of drawing together of global climate change and local climate change knowledge, and ensuring that it's not colonialised, and ensuring that those local voices are heard within these classroom debates. This policy shift and new curriculum has clearly come from the government realising that their current system isn't working, that this current blanket curriculum for the whole of the country just doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose anymore. And what also needs to be remembered is that education doesn't happen in a vacuum. Children don't simply go to school and then that's it for them for the day. They go home, they watch TV. They go home and they speak to their parents and their friends and their families. They go home and they see that the river has risen, or they see that the rice crops are dying, or they see that actually nothing has changed, or they don't just have an education, they are learning all the time from many other sources. And I think this needs to be really considered and remembered when looking at the Vietnamese education system. There is this cultural system that I've kind of spoken about as this presentation's gone on that is absolutely critical to understanding why Western models can't typically be applied here, and indeed the opportunities that are within this cultural system that can be maximised in ensuring that education is accessible and that it does what the country needs moving forward into these challenging times. The fact that they value education so much is actually a really strong point. If this can be maximised in the right way, then that's brilliant. The fact that they are a collectivist country shows real promise in the face of these future challenges, for example. And the fact that they do think about future generations and other people, as well as themselves and their most localized family, that's a real strength that we potentially don't really have here in the UK, for example. And what I think really is worth remembering here is this isn't about one country doing things better than another. This isn't about a right or a wrong way. This is about finding the most appropriate way for each country, which it looks like Vietnam are trying to do. And I really do hope that it works and that they are able to find a way to implement this new way of teaching and allow that to roll out throughout the whole country so that children are prepared for these future challenges that they're going to face. So I'll leave it there. I really hope that you've enjoyed my whistle-stop tour of the Vietnamese education system in a changing world. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, if you have any questions, if there's anything I can help you with, drop me an email, come and contact me on Twitter, whichever one, and I'll try and help you as best as I can. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.